Hey everyone, it's Bernard again. This time we'll be going over API and JavaScript, and let's go ahead and get started. So let's just begin with an introduction on API. API stands for Application Programming Interface, and what it does is act as a middleman between two ends that communicate with one another. So in the lecture that we did a little act. My friend Jack, Gagan, and I. So in this example, what we did was we had Gagan, who was our little API, then in the middle between me and Jack. Jack was basically the front end, and what he did was he wanted to get pizza. So he basically scrolled through the website and told Gagan, hey, I want to order this pizza. That means he sent the request. And when he sent the request for some pizza, Gagan just basically came to me and said, hey, Jack wants some pizza. So I was the back end and I was just making some pizza. And then I handed that pizza off to Gagan. And Gagan went back to Jack and said, hey, here's the pizza from Bernard. And Jack just ate the pizza. And that was a little act that we did. And what we wanted to demonstrate was that Jack was the front end, I was the back end, and Gagan, the one who was getting the request, sending it to me, and then getting the pizza from me, and then sending it back to Jack. That's the API. So API is essentially the communicator, the little messenger, the middleman between two ends of a website. And what I really want to demonstrate from that is that think of every real world example as examples of APIs. So let me go ahead and get started in terms of what I mean. There's this thing called Restful Api, Representative State Transfer API. REST API, this is the type of thing that you see every single day. Every time you open up a website, you're making an API call, whether or not you know it. So you're making a request to get something. And an example is like, imagine you're going to Piazza. So when you say piazza.com, and then you click on a button that's, log in, and then you choose Boston University, and then you choose the fall 2021 option, and then you go to the class that you want to go to, and then you click resources. You're making an API call to get to some endpoint, some link. This is just a link, but this is an API that goes to some point, and what you call the endpoint. And once you get to that point, some data will be called on the back end, and then that data would be sent to the front end so you can see the things that you wanted to see. And the thing about Restful API is that it just uses HTTP for API protocol. But HTTP means it's just the hyperlink that you go through. So it's just this part that you see. It uses the web to get data. So it uses the web to host data, to transfer data from one end to another end. And there's a couple protocols that we have to go through about APIs. An API has four main jobs. So a job is to either create, read, update, or delete data. So this is an acronym you'll hear over and over again. It's called CRUD, 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 CRUD. Always remember CRUD. CRUD is essentially the foundation of APIs. An API is either creating data. So imagine you want to create a user account on Twitter. When you create an account on Twitter, you fill out a form, and then you press create account. That is creating data. So an API will get that information that you just gave it, send that to the backend. The backend will put it in some database. Another thing is read. It can read data. So every time you go to some link or you want to look up a song on Spotify, you are trying to read some data. So, excuse me, I just typing in the song that you want. The API gets that text, sends that to the backend, and says, hey, backend, I need some data, look up this song. And then the backend finds that data and then gives it back to you. That is reading the data. Updating the data, so changing relationship status. So there's some database out there that says, at this person relationship status is this. Now we can just say this is now the new relationship status. Deleting the data, imagine deleting your Instagram photo, and you can actually permanently delete it from the database. So this is one of the slides that I skipped, but essentially I already spoke about it. It's just Jack was the front end, the client, and I was the back end, the server, the thing that you don't see. I just want to also make sure I really emphasize the differences between front end and back end. The front end is what you see. It's the thing you see on the website. Every time you go on, I don't know, YouTube, right? You see all the YouTube videos that you can watch, right? But once you click play a video, you have to get some sort of data. So the backend handles that. So the backend has to get the data from the video, the audio, the comment section, the likes, the dislikes, all that information. It has to fetch it, and then it has to get it from some database, and it has to consistently monitor it and update it. And then the front end, the client, is what basically sees those information. And those are the main fundamentals. And the API acts as an intermediate, lower messenger, the lower middleman that can deliver information from front end to the back end, and so on. Cool. So just to review, recap, API, four main things: CRUD, create, read, update, delete. HTTP requests are RESTful APIs. These are the kind of things that happen over web. And another thing is that just the API acts as a middleman between front end and back end. There's a couple more things we wanted to go over in terms of JavaScript. So we've already mentioned const and let variables that allows you to create variables using const keyword or let keyword. The difference is that when you use a const keyword, you cannot change the variable. It is immutable, meaning so if you create a variable called my name and you set it to a string that says Bob, you can't change that string anymore, or even change the value of my name, because it is going to be consistently the same name. Let, on the other hand, allows you to create a variable that can dynamically change. It can change its type. It can change its value. It can change anything. Couple cool things on JavaScript. If you ever get a chance, put this code into JavaScript and see what happens. It's essentially a really cool thing, alert. So it's a little pop-up, and it's really cool. If you get a chance, go ahead and play around with alert. Cool. The main thing that we wanted to teach you guys about JavaScript from the perspective of APIs is this thing called JSON, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And it can come in two ways. It can come in as a string, or it can come in as an object. The main goal is to make it into an object. So what this means is that when a JSON, first of all, JSON object notation, JavaScript object notation, what does that mean? What that means is that this is basically a dictionary, a key value pair system. So we have a key. So in this example, the key is name and the value is John. And the little comma says, okay, we have a new key pair value. Now the new key pair value is age and as the key, and the value is 30. So it's just it's a way of storing information inside of a bunch of key pair value. So inside of it, it could also be an array, or it could even be another object inside an object. So just know that once it comes into a variable, once it comes in as the string, you can't really index into it. You can't really select the data. So what we want to do is JSONify it, turn it into JSON object. So once you do that, you can index into name, which is the key, and then you'll immediately get the value, which is John. JSON is just very efficient for the fact that it's very memory friendly. It's very light in terms of memory, and also very quick to access data. And also the fact it's very convenient and easy to understand as a beginner. One way to parse a JSON from a string to a JSON object is just to have a variable. You can make it your own original JSON object, and then just pass that in to this little code here that says JSON.parse. And then you can parse the JSON on your string into a JSON object, and then you can store it into the original. Cool. There's another cool thing about JavaScript. This is something that it took me a while to understand. So definitely don't be confused about this. This might be confusing at first, but feel free to ask questions. So this thing called a promise. JavaScript is notorious for having a thing called promises, where a line of code can make a promise that this thing will be returned to it. So what this means is that Oftentimes, JavaScript makes an API call, and that API call takes some time to get back. So imagine saying that, hey, you call somebody, right? And they say, hey, I'll call you back in 5 minutes, right? So you hang up and basically you just don't call anybody else. You stay on your phone, but you don't expect to do anything with your phone. You don't expect your phone to die or anything like that. You just don't do anything with your phone until you get that phone call back, right? So it's the same thing here. You make an API call, you don't move to the next line until you make that API call. That API call return back to you. This is a promise. So saying, hey, I promise I won't move on until I get your response. And you can either get a response that is resolved or reject, meaning you can have an API call that is successful, meaning I got the data that I wanted, and the backend gave me the data, or it can reject, meaning, hey, the backend does not like your code or doesn't like your request, maybe because of security reasons, and it can reject it, and then you can move on to the next line of code. And to determine something to be what's called asynchronous is just to say that this function, this type of function, is something that makes a promise and will wait until it gets some response. So every time you have a asynchronous function, a kind of function that makes an API call, and that is especially time consuming, you always have to make it an asynchronous function. You have to define it as asynchronous function. You can do it one way, which is this is an arrow function. Another way to do it is just to say async, and then the function, and then the name of the function. So you can say foo, right? And then you can write the code here. Make sure async is lowercase. And then inside the code, there's a thing called a wait. A wait is essentially like, especially when you're making the call there. In this case, we're making a call, we're fetching some URL. We're fetching some data for an API. We want to specify that we will be waiting for that call to finish. So in order to summarize, what I'm trying to say is that JavaScript makes some promises that can be resolved or rejected, and then it can move on. And the most important thing is that when you're making a function that is asynchronous, that makes a promise, is that you specify it as async in the beginning. And every time you make that call, the API call, you specify that wait. That's it. Cool. I think we're ready to go ahead and get started with the code. So the challenge is just to create some HTML, forget the CSS for now, in the JavaScript code. So this time we'll just be taking some form in that takes an input and some button, and some value we'll be putting in there, and then we'll write it in JavaScript where we parse that value, and then we'll make an API call to Pokemon API, just Poke API. So if you go to this website, https://pokeapi.co, you will come to this website, which basically it's a great documentation that allows you to try getting information. So this is a Pokemon. This is what's called a Restful API, by the way, because it's a URL. This is a HTTP URL, right? So this little link gives you data. And that data is this data right here. This thing here is a JSON data. So one of the keys is abilities, and abilities have arrays of other objects. And inside of it, there's another thing called ability. And then under that, there's a name of the ability, which is Limber for Ditto. I don't know who Ditto is, but if you guys like Pokemon, then you probably know this. Cool. There's another thing you can get. If you can get to the weight, you can index into it and you can get the value, which is 40 for Ditto. So we can also try for something else like Pikachu, which is a Pokemon, and then load data. And this time the weight of Pikachu is 60. The height is 4. So we're going to be playing around with that and just making some API call. Cool. Let's go ahead and get started. The way to get started first, let's just create a new folder. Let's rename it. Let's just call it JavaScript JS API. All right, we're going to open that folder on VS Code. So open, let's go to desktop, JS API. and we're going to create a HTML. To create an HTML, we say index.html, and we're going to create a JavaScript. So let's just call it index as well, index.js. JS specifies it as a JavaScript file. Let's close it and then open it up again. So that way we have live video code. There should be go live option. In order for you guys who missed it, to get the go live, you just want to install the extension. So you can go here, the little thing that's called extension. You can just download this thing called Live Server. That's a really cool app. Just make sure that you have your autosave on, and you can install it and use it. It's a really great tool. Cool. Let's just go ahead and go live. And as you guys know, to initialize HTML, you can do exclamation point, enter, and what's it called? VS Code gives you a bunch of really cool template to start with. Inside the body, I want to have, based on this, you want to have what's called a form, an input, and a button element. Okay, let's go ahead and create those. So let's create a form, an input, and at the end of it, we want a button. Okay, let's see what the website has. If we refresh it, there it is. Okay, cool. So let me just add some H3 tag that says, I don't know, pick a Pokemon. All right, pick a Pokemon. So the form, it does not need an action for now, but it does need an ID. Let's give it an ID. And in this case, so that way we can pick the thing inside of it. So let's give it an ID. Let's just set Pokemon form. And the input, which is the most important thing, is what we need an ID for as well. This is the Pokemon itself. So what somebody puts in as an input will be the Pokemon that we want to select and get the data of. And the button, let's just put something like send in between it. Cool. So what this does is fill out a form. And let's say if we put in ditto and we press send, it should call JavaScript to basically get the data that we want, make an API call, and display it somewhere here. So let's just have something to display. So let's just say H2 tag. Let's give it an ID, and maybe the ID could just be result. And inside of it, it just a weight and height. So I want height. I want power. Let me put them in two separate actually. That's fine. Let's just do a bunch of power. None for now. Cool. So what we want is this thing to say weight is whatever the weight of the thing that we put in is, and the power to be displayed here. So we're going to be targeting H2 as a way to manipulate this and update this with the values that we get. But we're going to we're first going to need what the person inputs. So what is the Pokemon that the person wants to see? Cool. First, let's create a URL, const URL variable that basically holds the URL that we want. This is the URL that basically allows us to make an API call. So it's going to be that /Pokemon / whatever after that, it's going to be whatever the user puts in. Okay. Now the goal is to just get the input value first, right? Let's go ahead. If you remember, before we do that, let's actually go ahead and start writing a function that basically makes the API call that gets the value the person puts in and make the API call. So, like I mentioned, we're going to have to write async first because this will be an asynchronous function, and we can name the function. Matter of fact, get Pokemon. That could be the name of the function. So first thing we want to do is whatever the person puts in here, we want to get that value. So what we can do is store that into a variable, let Pokemon equal document dot get element by ID, and the ID is Pokemon. If you don't know what I'm doing here, I suggest watching the video before this, the JavaScript part 1, so that way you can understand what document get element by ID means. So let's inspect, so that way we can see what's going on in the console. And let's go ahead and actually console log, meaning print Pokemon. Let's see what happens when we print it. So that way we know what value we're getting. But also remember, do you have to connect our HTML and JavaScript together? To do that, we have to use script. And inside of it, we have to say source src is equal to quotation mark the name of the file that holds the JavaScript that we want, which is index.js. Cool, HTML and JS are not connected. Now, another thing is that when we click the button, we want to call some function. We want some function to execute. So when we do that, the way to do that is to say on click, we want to call some function on JavaScript, which is get Pokemon. And it knows that it goes to this get Pokemon because it connects to this JavaScript. So we say get Pokemon. Awesome. So what happens is that when we click a button, when we click this button, this function gets called. This function, what that does is get element by ID of some ID called Pokemon, and then it prints it. So let's go ahead and play around with it. Let's type in ditto first, and there it is. There's your little HTML input. That's really cool. But we want the value. So you can just say dot value, and that should print out the value. Let me refresh this page. And nothing happened. Oh, there it is. There it is. Value is getting printed. So this is good. This means that whatever the user puts in will be saved into a variable called Pokemon. Now, what do we want to do with that? We want to make an API call. So the API call is going to be this URL plus the Pokemon that they want to see. Just like how they documented, it's going to be this URL link plus the Pokemon that they want to see. So we can store that into a variable. Let's just say let, I don't know, response equal the URL. Actually, let's store in a variable called API. API equal URL plus the Pokemon that they want to see. Cool. Now we're going to fetch the API. So let response, right, is equal to, response is going to hold some value of the fetch. Remember, when we fetch, we have to specify await. So we say await and then fetch the API. And then let's just console log the response just to show what's going on. Ditto, and there it is. There's a response saying, hey, this is a 200 response, meaning it's a successful response at doing the job. Now, we have to convert this this little here. Oh, by the way, the // just makes it a comment. A comment does not get executed. It just gets ignored by the compiler. So it allows you to just basically leave a comment for yourself, but it will not be executed, which is a good thing. Okay, so let's get the data. To get the data, we're going to have to convert it into a JSON. We're going to have to convert the response into a JSON. So we're going to say response.json. But be aware of the fact that a wait is necessary for converting the response, because the response waits for the API. The response waits for the API, and thus we wait for a conversion into JSON. Same thing here. And then we can console log the data. And now we should look at that. there's the data about data. So we got, what is it? Weight is here. And the height is here. And the power, well, the power will be going from ability to index 0, and then ability, and then we get the name, and then which is number. So let's write some code that does that. Let me go ahead and show you guys what this means. So when you, matter of fact, when you go to, let's create a variable called weight is equal to data at index weight. Console log it. So let's make another call to ditto, and then it's 40, right? The reason is because to index into a value on the object here, the JSON object here, all we have to do is go to the variables index, the one that we want. So the index that we wanted is weight. The information that we wanted is weight. So we just got to put it into a square bracket and then quotation mark what we wanted, so which is weight. So if we want something inside of that thing, then we index again. So in order to get to ability at index 0, at ability to this point, name, we're gonna have to do, I think I can remember how it goes, but matter of fact, why don't we do it here? So we have to go through, let's get the power. So let power equal data at index abilities. And then at index 0, this is the number. And then another index to get to the ability. And then an index again to get to the name. So that way we get the power here, static, for Pikachu name. So this is it. So what we can do is console log the weight and the power. For ditto, it's the weight 40, the power number. Now let's just go ahead and change these values. In order to do that, is just targeting what we want, which is this thing here, this ID, and then HTML equal to the value that we want. So we can do is, document dot get element by ID. The ID was result, and then we can do dot inner HTML equal to, and then we can manipulate it into whatever we want. And this case will say weight is equal to the weight that we stored into a variable plus the power is the power that we stored a variable in. So watch this. Weight right now is currently at 0 and power is none. But once we type in ditto, and there it is. Weight is 40, power is number. Okay, I don't like the way I put this out, but let's do Pikachu. Pikachu. There's the weight, 40, the power, static. There's that. This is how you make an API call using JavaScript. But I also want to go over another way to do it. This is the other way is fairly a little more complicated, but it's essentially does the same thing, but it's a little more industry practice. So you'll just say async, and it doesn't matter how you like create a function for now. Let's just say get Pokemon 2. This is another function. We'll do the same thing here. These will stay the same. So we get the Pokemon by getting it by the element ID, and then create a variable that just has the URL in the Pokemon. But now what we can do here is fetch the data that we want, which is API, right? And then we say .then. So the .then just basically says, hey, this flow here, this thing here is the API call. So it's a gonna have to be waiting. We're gonna have to wait for it. But once we're done waiting, then we're gonna have some code that can run here. This code will be just basically getting the data from the fetching. So it's just gonna be respond. And then we do an error where it's just gonna be another API, another response. Let's just console log it real quick. Response. And let's make sure that our function here calls it. So this time on click, we're only gonna call the Pokemon function too. So let's go ahead and call ditto, and there it is. There's a response. The response is a successful response. So now we're gonna have to turn that response into a JSON. So we say response, right? And then we're gonna have to do .then again, which this time we have it, we're gonna throw into a variable. And this time we do curly bracket to convert it into a function. And then let's just do a console log of the data. And what this does here is still does response. We're gonna have to do response.json, my apology, to response.json, and then we're gonna get the data. Now that response is converted into JSON, now we have the data that we want, which is weight and abilities, all the information that we want, right? Note that this time, this one has a squiggly bracket, this one does not have a squiggly bracket. Making a squiggly bracket after the arrow just basically allows you to write functional code instead of, doing, this time we're actually doing a bunch of lines of code instead of just one line of code. So this time we can do functional stuff like getting a variable, the weight, and then the power. That's the same line of code. And after that, we just document in an HTML. And there it is. Once we type in ditto, there's the power and there's the weight. This time we're calling this function. The only difference is the .then. It's just another way of writing code in JavaScript, making asynchronous call. This one is a little more industry practice. This is also another way to do it. Cool. I also want you guys to be aware of another thing called Rapid API. If you ever get a chance to work with Rapid API, it's a wonderful tool. You get to pick any categories of APIs that you want to work with. I personally love working with music, so I usually use music. I go to here and I choose the category of music. You can do recipes, you can do all types of things, and just learn how to work around with APIs to give you a bunch of code snippets so you can just copy and paste code, execute, and see what kind of code you get. And it's free, and it's a great documentation tool, and it's a great way to learn how to use APIs. And another one is just API Finney, which is a wonderful tool to get free APIs and read a lot of information on other people's way of writing code that uses some APIs and just get some inspiration. APIs is just the name of the game in web development. So yeah, hope you guys learned something. Thank you.